Hello and welcome, Jeremy, Neal, Matt.
Hello.
Welcome, gentlemen.
Hello.
And always a pleasure with Sebastian and Peter, likewise. So welcome to all.
Hi.
Hi.
Wonderful. So without saying too much, if you will, we're going to dive right in. Definitely for all those that are listening to the recording or joining us live at this point, feel free to look up these fine individuals by all means to learn more about their backgrounds. But our general objective is really to explore the House of Antifragility, which we actually made public about just around a month ago. So without saying too much more, I'm going to hand it off to Neal to kind of kick us off and we'll get the conversation happening.
Okay, so well, the first thing I want to say, well, I'll clear my throat first. So the first thing I want to say is many thanks to Sai, Sebastian, and Peter for actually creating this model and publishing it and getting it out there. And as I was saying to you earlier, this is a creative piece, that you've come together and actually created this. And often that creativity requires containment before, getting it out into the wild. It's something that's very precious. At the same time, we recognize that this is a model, requires some challenging and some testing and some stress testing in the true spirit of anti-fragility and being agile. So here we are, hopefully in a very supportive and a very supportive environment to really have a look at this model with the aim of understanding the model better and its role in anti-fragility. And Matt, Jeremy, and I had a little discussion beforehand, and we came up with some questions. And I thought maybe starting at the highest level, let's get Jeremy to kick us off. Are you okay with that, Jeremy?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Neal. So I guess I want to start with basically some brief, origin story. How this came to become, a house. How did you manifest it, basically, this model of antifragility around this concept of a house? Did it land by itself like that naturally, and you realized with this aha moment, or did you kind of like figured out, that this model may have been better to convey all the meaning behind antifragility and this principle?
Excellent question. Peter, Sebastian, any thoughts before I chime in?
I think, especially if we mention the house, I think the best person who could answer this question is Sai, because the idea of the house comes from Sai. So this is the perfect person who should answer this question.
You're very kind, dear friend. Anything to add, Peter?
I relaxed and casual atmosphere I forgot in your environments. I am delighted our initiative has met with a response. In my opinion, it's absolutely a fantastic job from Sai. House of Antifragility is the best solution, best idea in first stage of the designing and development and implementation our ideas. Thank you so much for Sai for this idea and a possibility of the progress in this subject.
You're both too kind. They're both far too kind. So the origin story, I think, is an important one, exactly as you mentioned. Really, first off, everything that is in the model is actually already stress tested. I'll put it that way. So that's very key. And so we took experiences from Sebastian, from Peter, and myself, and we blended it. So I would say this rendition is composed of very stress tested elements already, and I think the rendition of it gives a particular viewpoint, etc. And what I mean by that very specifically, and you can look up all our backgrounds, of course, is if we zoom in a little bit as to the origins, think about reality as really a collection of tensions. That's what reality is all about. So the question becomes now is how do you package those tensions, whether you call it a framework or model, so that we can engage in sense making, right? Decision making, and then action taking. And in saying all those, that's really the origin story, taking experiences, blending it in such a way, etc. The without being too elaborate, with and taking our time, if you will. Um, the two pillars I think that really have guided us with the experiences is it's a practice informed theory or practice informed model. That's why I say it's already stress tested in many ways, which continues to evolve. And we also practice, all three of us, from a theory driven practice, so that we do have a perspective of how we're operating. So that notion is very, very much key for advancing the model in the community. And as we get going, you'll see a lot of the roots, especially in the core and the foundation, to be back from the book that came out in 2016, The Antifragility Edge, as well as other books historically, all the way back to 2013 and even years before. So I hope that gives a little bit, Jeremy, to your question about the origin story.
Yeah, thank you. I think
we did not expect the beginning to have the whole subject explained to us, or to have anything explained to us. We wanted to propose a discussion in first stage to start researching the model and to show that it has practical relevance. That's all. In first stage, it is researching this model, and we wanted to propose a discussion.
So you said that it's been stress tested already, that you've been using it. So how have you been using it? How have you been using this model in your own personal lives or with your own business? And could you give an example of that?
Sebastian,
Okay,
Peter,
so,
yeah, please.
Maybe I will start. The idea, so this model, as you see this right now, was not the same 1 month or 2 months ago. Before that, we use some of those principles that you see here in our life or in our business, but we do not have this creation as one framework, one model, composed in specific groups, and so on. So we use some of these principles, but we do not group it or name it like it is here. Generally, during our work for creating the house, we propose, any of us propose something, and we try to blend it, those ideas and those main principles, name it, and then describe it like you see right now in the model. So the first idea was create our perspective, our own perspective. Each of us write down our perspective. Then we discuss it in a few of the meetings, and after that, we try to find out this thoughts or the same ideas. We use it in our life, our business, or during the consulting work, or during our private our private life, and then create something that other people could use it. Because the idea, for example, let's say let's start from explore yourself for stress. I could have two examples, one from my private life. So I try to expose my body for cold during the Wim Hof method exercises, like going into the barrel with cold water or going into the barrel with ice. This is the one idea, to to create some tension in my body, not for a long time, just to create some tension, not to try to the idea is to not to live life in one line, just to use it as a sinusoid or other kind of stress. And this is the one idea. And the second idea of the expose our company for stress testing. So sometimes taking the project, we know that we are. It is the first time in our life. We've got some backgrounds, some consulting backgrounds, but sometimes the projects are quite big, and it could be challenging for us to do it. But we know that after that, when we end it, we will have a very specific experience that we could take another much more difficult project, more difficult job.
My experience is as follow. Where I was doing audits or any consultancy or audit engagement, such approach was missing. We did audits in Poland, in Polish environments, and many companies suffered significant losses because they were not business resilient. They were fragile. I worked in National Bank of Poland, where the stress testing in the banking sector was very expensive. Many companies needed this solution, and in my opinion, this solution is very profitable and useful.
Excellent. And I'll add to the gentleman's, if you will, contribution. Very, very specifically, there's two case studies that are approximately 10 plus years old, actually in the public domain. One is relative to cars.com, and these are publicly available, so you could listen to them tell their story, if you will. And then the other one is Autovin, if you will. And both of those case studies, again, about a decade old, where the principles really were applied that came into this model, in particular, amongst others. So those are two public ones amongst others. But in particular, what I have found is that organizations, groups within organizations, people have a difficulty dealing with a few things. One is reality. Everybody likes to tell themselves a story and then believe their story. And then the other one is human nature, and make presumptions about human nature and then go ahead and live against those presumptions. And then at the end of the day, when you look at those two, the core question becomes a question of identity. Who are we and what are we all about at an individual or a collective level? Well, to integrate those pieces, and this is my work, if you will, that I do, to integrate those pieces, we use awareness. And that's really what manifests through as transformation. So now taking that backdrop and relating it directly to the model and the clients that I work with, helping them recognize that foundation is about reality and what reality means to them. So that's the key thing about using rules in terms of understanding that reality and the randomness that surrounds it and the stresses that it causes. And then really having some notion of being virtuous, whatever that may mean to them in whatever sense. That's the human nature and reality piece of it that comes into play. That's the foundation. And then working with organizations to help them recognize that is key. That's why it's just a foundation. The core pieces now comes to two key concepts. One is, and you've really heard them, dealing with reality from the perspective of what's really happening versus the stories we make up. And then two, not only what's really happening and being able to survive and ultimately thrive, but having the wisdom to be able to adapt and evolve. So those two key words, wisdom and empirical or empiricism, really are associated with, if you will, the ability to adapt and evolve. A lot of organizations and a lot of teams can adapt, but can they truly evolve? And if you look at, I want to throw in another example, if you will. If you look at COVID, and a lot of the organizations that have been thriving in COVID really are lucky. They're not anti-fragile. They're not evolving through that COVID experience. And then the other piece, if I can add, if you will, relative to adapting and evolving, also surviving and thriving, and those are two pieces are connected there. One thing I'll add, and I think Jeremy, you might have a question or what have you. One other thing I'll add is, as you look at the elements in the model, there is direct tension that's actually built in between all the pieces. So they're complements and they're polar complements. But working with organizations to tease out the specifics, I hope that gives a little bit of flavor to the answer without continuing to elaborate.
It does, and it is quite interesting. Those two aspects that you mentioned about, the reality, like being a designer, I, use basically human perception to, design my interfaces, design to create a relation between a service, a product, and, a person, a human being, with all its flaws as well. We're all flawed, we're designed by nature with these flaws because they somehow serve us as well, but they're not enough. And yeah, you're right. We tend to perceive reality as like something that we want to, as a story we tell to ourselves, like you said. And for that reason, we're often misled. We often believe false tales. And I think the second point is also quite intriguing, but Neal, Matt, do you want to jump on anything at this moment before I go to?
Yeah, I've definitely got 2 points, but Matt, you haven't spoken yet, so I'll defer to you.
So I mean, yeah, I think you guys are doing a great job of, I guess, feeding in your own experiences and relevance and how it fits in, and it's interesting to see how that's come about. I suppose how it's fed into the model. Yeah, you talked a bit about the kind of shape of the house as well, and it kind of seems like a bit of a throwaway point, and but I'm interested in kind of the overall shape and possibly the dynamics between the foundation and some of the pillars as well. So you sort of mentioned around having this firm base and this kind of tension between different elements, and I wonder if there's anything else there, and possibly leading up to the roof more towards the purpose shape, the kind of upwards triangle. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, excellent question, Matt. Peter, Sebastian, would you like to comment on that, or I can definitely comment on that as well? But definitely want to invite your perspective first.
In my perspective, very short. Quite a challenging experience for me as an auditor was the omnipresent house, difficulties of communication, which had a negative impact on the organizational maturity. If these problems were overlapped with the issues of digitalization and informatization, the problem increased even more. They did not disappear, but become more acute. I believe that this House of Fragility is a prelude to standardization for next steps in progress for implementation this model in practice, in business practice. Very short.
Thank you, Peter. Sebastian, any thoughts, my good friend?
Please, Ty. The floor is yours.
You're very kind, far too kind. So if you go back to kind of what I said, and thank you, Matt, for that question. And gentlemen, Jeremy, Matt, Neal, the questions are really good because they're teasing out the specifics. So thank you for the questions all around. If you go back to kind of what I said, if you think about reality as a collection of tensions that we're working with, anything that we do is going to essentially shift the tension, shift the landscape, right? Some of us would call it stress as we experience it on the other side. As Jeremy, you described, what is the experience that I have as I encounter a particular situation, and the way it's been designed or cultivated as another sort of word. So as you look at the house, we take those tensions in particular, and I'm going to call out a few of them. We take those tensions and we organize them, and then we say, okay, now how do those tensions integrate and synthesize? So saying that general sense, we embrace an and perspective in terms of polarities. We don't say or, right? It's not you're avoiding or learning, for example. You've got to be avoiding and learning is very, very key as a tension that has to be resolved. Additionally, if you look at purpose, Well, it's actually in tension with learning and avoiding as well. So are you serving your purpose, if you will, and learning along the way, and likewise avoiding, or are you bringing them out of balance? So there's the element of integration and synthesis is very key. I'm going to use the word synthesis a little bit further. If you take the model and you say, here's a specific context, whether it be business, for-profit, nonprofit. I love Peter's aspects relative to risk management and dealing with risk auditing and what have you, and Sebastian's elaboration on both personal and professional anti-fragility. You take these elements, put them in a specific context, and now you begin to work with those tensions. So calling out the more specific tensions relative to the diagram. So there's the thought process around tensions and polarities. And if I use the magical, there's two magical words I'll say, and they're magical in the sense that they really capture a core here. One is paradox. Paradox is inherent. People try to remove paradox. We can't remove paradox. We have to engage it, embrace it even. That's very key. And then the other aspect is ecosystems. Respectfully, thinking in systems is one level, thinking in ecosystems is a whole different level. And the marketplace is rampant with noise today, very, very openly. And there's more of a backstory relative to 2020 that I can get into, but I'll put that off to the side for a minute. I've done enough blogging on those aspects, respectfully. So if you look at the tensions that are here, it's very interesting. In the foundation, you've got two sets of tensions. You've got the simple rules and virtuousness in tension with reality, being randomness and stress. So there's an inherent tension that's built into the foundation already. That's one. The next tension, if you will, is the one that's built in between wisdom and empiricism. You have to, in order to increase your wisdom, you have to be empirical. But in order to be empirical, you have to have wisdom as to know when and where to be empirical. So there's a natural tension between those two. I've already mentioned adapting and evolving versus surviving and thriving. Those are inherent tensions as well. And there's actually a blog that we're working on to expose these tensions even more explicitly, and in the commentary that we've put out. So if you look at the house and you only embrace the foundation and the core, and you remove learning, remove avoiding, remove purpose, you've got what you need. Now take the core and the foundation, put it in the context of today. When you look at most people in organizations or in the world, they talk about learning and they talk about avoiding. So what do we need to learn in terms of from our past, in terms of what do I have to unlearn, and in terms of how can I learn from our challenges and failures? All those are in tension around learning. If I flip over to the avoiding, yes, it's great to learn stuff, but I don't want to push myself to an extreme that I jeopardize my survival. So we need to avoid things. Avoid the big risks, right? Those risks will essentially put you out and kill you at that point. Or as Taleb would say, they ruin you if you attempt those big risks. So there's a balance that's to be avoided. Additionally, data. We can swim in data, but is it really informing us? And then focusing more on other things to avoid. So there's a natural tension there, and those two are in tension together. Flip to purpose. If you look at purpose, you have to look at, if you will, as we say, soul in the game. And as you think about soul in the game, what's your motivation? That's really the key thing about soul in the game. What's your motivation? And then having the broad view and the detailed view, those are a natural tension, but you have to be able to zoom out, zoom in, and be able to bring that into balance with your motivation. So there's the natural tension there. Learning and avoiding are in tension, purpose is in tension, likewise to those two. But if I go to the house, I look at the learning and avoiding, and I say I, in double quotes, learning and avoiding and purpose are actually adornments to the core and the foundation. In a different time in history, if someone were to look at anti-fragility, I think they would use different words versus learning and avoiding. And to be very frank, I'm not a fan of the word learning. Why? Because most organizations associate learning with pure education, when the reality is what we're interested in is evolution. We learn to evolve, but it takes other factors into play. I talked for a very long time. I hope I exposed some of the tensions, and there's a blog in the works that will kind of even lay these out further, as Peter, Sebastian, and myself have already captured some of that on the website. I hope that elaborates a bit, Matt.
Thanks. So that's great.
So for me, this now comes to probably the crux of perhaps how I want to challenge you. And so on the one hand, it's this notion of, okay, we've got principles here and a model, and there seems to be both here. So actually, there are principles, and you know, the first question would be, why not just have principles rather than a model with principles? And I think I know what you're going to say to that. So my follow-up question: if this is a model which is to communicate the tensions, do you think it actually communicates that?
Sebastian or Peter, would you like to comment on that, or?
Okay, so the model or the framework we've created is the idea of putting those principles in some broader context. Because if we would just create the list of the principles and do not put it in the context of the groups, the tension between those groups, and create.
I get that, but does it
okay?
Communicate that?
Okay, could you repeat?
I understand why you've done that, but the model, does it communicate those tensions, and is it something that people can then use for that purpose?
I think so. You know, because the in the model itself, there is no information about the tensions. But after the last discussion, the last event, webinar, we were participating, and there was some questions about the tension between some of the purposes. We create the description and our ideas to describe the audience this tensions and the idea of the opposites. So we add some additional thoughts about this in the description of the model.
In my perspective, avoiding risk is not enough to create business. We need to create value through research, learning, sharing knowledge. We are incredibly fortunate that our profession, we are auditors, has allowed us to view many organizations from the perspective of their fragility. That's why we want to share this experience. We want to develop a common base of good practice. We would like to hear what you think about it and how we can improve this model. We do not feel we are the sole masters of this model. We want to present it to you as valuable people and business practitioners, not only to evaluate, but to work together for this business model.
Thank you, Sebastian and Peter. So Neal, to the question, if you will, I think there's a couple thoughts there. One is at the level of abstraction of the visual, if you will, that's one of the reasons the house is powerful. It does communicate some sense of those tensions, but it only can communicate it at that level of abstraction. As an example, if you remove purpose and replace it with something else, then essentially there's something that could be added on top of it. If you remove avoiding or remove learning, the house becomes lopsided. So there's definitively a tension that's identified there. If you remove the foundation, and this is why we have the foundation looking, again, this is at the visual level, different than the core or the mid layer, if you will, forgive me, of the house. If you remove that foundation, then is there something that those three would require? And that would be, yes, again, another tension that's needed. If you remove the core, then what integrates or what binds, if you will, or what gives soul to the house? So at a visual level, it communicates that tension in that way. And then at the more descriptive level, definitively the tensions can be exemplified. But you'd have to look at the description, etc. And that's kind of what we've been doing, or elaborating, if you will. So I don't know if that addresses your question, Neal, or if there was more to it that you were asking.
Yeah, so I mean, I think perhaps a follow-up would be that if you are applying this, or the examples that you've given to of times when you have applied it, is that because you had already internalized these principles and you were communicating this, or were you actually using like a model and showing this to people to say, this is what we're talking about, and then they get that aha moment?
So excellent question, and this goes back to what I kind of said in the beginning relative to the model. In particular, it's a practice discovered, practice informed model. So if I look back 20 years ago, my experience, or Sebastian or Peter, likewise, if you look back 20 years ago, the principles were emerging in our experience. Integrating them into some sense of a model mentally for us as we were operating is one aspect. And then when we came together, we formulated the model in this visual sense in the House of Antifragility. But I think, as Peter, you mentioned, we didn't start with the idea of let's create a House of Antifragility, or Sebastian, right? We did not have that thought initially. So this manifestation of it is a rendition of the tensions that we have empirically discovered to have worked, if you will, and giving them names and integrating them in our experience.
Yeah. Oh, go on, Neal.
I was just saying, when you say worked, by definition, you mean by being adaptable and achieving that anti-fragility, and that's what you mean by.
Exactly. And the key thing,
Okay.
and the key thing, I think is it's the key thing, especially relative to anti-fragility. It's not an absolute concept. You actually can't be anti-fragile or not anti-fragile. You can achieve different degrees of anti-fragility based on the source, the degree of stress, the recovery time, all those facets. So exactly to your point, in those contexts, those principles worked in one form or another to create the conditions for greater anti-fragility, but not necessarily make an organization or a group or an individual completely immortal. Yeah, because the concept is a relative concept, and that's very, very key from Taleb's work, quite honestly.
So that's where I think I'm not still like sure, because from what I get from like reading Antifragile by Nicolas Taleb is that there is a certain, he's talking about dynamism, right? At certain moment, he's talking about what makes something stable, and you get two types of stability. You get the stability of a house, right? This one that is static. You get the pillars, etc. It's very stable, like the pyramids, basically, of Egypt. Withstand time. But you get also another type of stability, which is, like riding a bike. It's like you're not supposed to fall as long as you keep going, something. So, or like a spinning top. It's the same logic. It's like this. The momentum is bringing the stability, and it resonates when you talk about the tension, basically, that exists in this principle, because I believe that those tensions are actually what makes the whole anti-fragile concept something dynamic, as a spinning top. It's like, it's because of this tension, things are moving and evolving all the time. It's alive. There is like there is some, it's like the universe is something like magical where things comes to play, etc. You don't really know the intent absolutely firsthand, but it somehow clicks together. It has a purpose together as well, but it cannot. It's more complex, I would say, than. Of course, you need a model to simplify therefore this complexity, and that's your take. And I'm happy to see a model for the first time about anti-fragile as well. That kind of resonates with the underlying principles here. So, but I believe there is like, maybe we need to look into, maybe there is something around designing a model that looks like this sort of, dynamic system that is stable, but not stable as a house. Maybe there's a way here you can better convey, and I'm talking as a designer, right? So I give you also like some tips for that, but maybe you can convey that dynamism because they're not necessarily separated. Some of them also, it's like a spectrum, right? You said it's neither like fully fragile or fully anti-fragile. You are somewhere on the spectrum and you can move along, etc., be nudged around. So maybe something here can be done to like somehow really present those dynamism.
If I could just piggyback on that before you answer, Side, because sometimes we look at a lot of models, let's say like a bell curve, and you say, well, okay, you are here, or what was that one you were showing me the other day, Jeremy? Is that you?
The U theory.
Yeah.
Sharma,
so there is some sort of you are here in a very sort of two-dimensional perspective, and sometimes I wonder, something like that in terms of, where are you on that scale of, fragility? And I know it's at different levels. Something like that would actually interest me a lot as well. And I don't know if that's also something that you.
Did we lose Jeremy? Oh, or Neal? I'm sorry. Did you? Neal, did we? I
think I just lost my connection there, sir.
Yeah, we got you back now.
Okay, over to you, Si, I think.
Okay. So really good question. Really good questions. So there's a couple thoughts here. There's multiple layers underneath, so that it's actually very dynamic. It's not static. Exactly to your point, Jeremy. But you have to realize we can't put everything in one picture. So let me say that what you were talking about, I refer to as mechanics and dynamics, actually, in the book that's published. And it is actually another version or rendition that essentially has the core and the foundation that's built into it. But that dynamism is there, and I call it dynamics and mechanics, and there is a spectrum, and there's a lot of detail that is beyond just, if you will, the House of Antifragility. The power of the house is it integrates in a very essential way, the core in particular and the foundation, the experiences that we've encountered, and I'll be very, very frank about it, I've yet to find an experience that can't be integrated, especially into the core. Other words might be used, but I've yet to find one. Not to say that the model is perfect or won't evolve, but there's a distillation of Taleb's work, of Yanir Bar-Yam's work as well, amongst others, that kind of has got us here. But all those pieces that you mentioned are there. They're just not elaborated, in this picture. Yeah. And I say that we've yet to find something that doesn't integrate. It's not coming from ego or arrogance, but where it's coming from is just finding cases, right, and experiences that to fit or to evolve.
And I would say it's absolutely fine as well to have more than one model, because we are all different as well. So some things may resonate better for other people, and so this one can resonate with a lot of people, and maybe you need other models to resonate with other type of people, because we all like somehow perceive things you said earlier, right, differently. So we need to play with that perception of reality as well.
Exactly.
Communication. So yeah, great.
Can I pick up on?
Yeah, if I can.
Yeah.
Forgive me, Neal, because Jeremy, I think I think it's very, very key. If you strip away a lot of what's here, it's those two pieces in the core that seem to transcend those models, and that's why we call it the heart and soul. And once you really kind of recognize those, it's very interesting. I'm trying to think. In the introduction, you remember Taleb's book, Antifragile. In the introduction, he's got the table, map of the world, I think he calls it. I'm trying to remember at this point, but the map of the world and what have you. In his book, if you look at that table, that's very, very key into his book, if you will, across the board. It can be distilled into the core. And that was one of the key things, quite honestly, that I had to do and tie it to practice back, when I published the first book. And then again, of course, meeting Peter and meeting Sebastian to integrate their experience in what you see. So completely agree, but I think it's managing our own expectations as to how much a model will work versus not work. Forgive me, Neal, I interrupted you.
Yeah, so I wanted to just pick up, we might be going a bit more into detail here. rather than staying at that higher level. But just seeing as we were talking about the core, and I wanted to pick up on this notion of wisdom. What do I do with that? You know, is that a principle, or is that something to aspire to? And that this is something that I struggled a bit actually with, because it's very easy to say, you know, be wise.
It's very easy. Sebastian, Peter, would you like to comment on that? Or?
Yeah, thanks. So the idea, we were struggling with, we were discussing with Sai, because the first word we would like to use was knowledge. And I said to Sai that the knowledge is not enough, because the knowledge is something theoretical. And we would like to use the different word that combines the experience of individual or organization, and add also the knowledge, and this experience and knowledge together create the wisdom. And the wisdom also is created during the time. So the older people and the more experienced the people are, they combine those experience and knowledge, and this is the wisdom that could implement in the real life. So the idea of the wisdom was to take something from the experience and something from learning from the traditional way of taking the knowledge from, let's say, the academical training or from the others.
Peter, would you like to add something?
For me, antifragility is not a zero-sum game. It is not a present. It is a constant aspiration to be better. We would not want this model to be too theoretical. Winsome for me is the ability to extract knowledge from experience. Many of the people who have been our clients in audits engagement, for example, have been expecting us to share some life wisdom. They knew the laughs, procedures, standards, but this knowledge was a better value in our work as auditors. Our initiative is closely related to actually helping business to be resilient. Resilient business is responsible business. It's Winsome for me. Business that is flexible, which means it quickly adapts to changing condition. It is resistant to adverse condition.
Excellent. And if I add to that, Neal, relative to wisdom, and this is elaborated a little bit in the description, of course, you know, very practically, if you will, do we experience the freedom to explore is a question that comes to mind. Do we, if you will, overtrust in our thought process or one solution or one model of reality? Exactly as Jeremy, you mentioned, if you will. That's another aspect of wisdom. Is there an acknowledgement that reality is far richer than one model? And have we really embraced that? Some of that requires relaxation of the ego, very critically, where most people really, really struggle. And likewise, thinking creatively and curiously in different aspects. So those are some of the, I'll say, the elements in the description that we've captured. If I translate that to practice, there's two particular things that are extremely evident relative to wisdom. One is, and we really, we see this at a multitude of levels, at the individual level, at the collective level, as well as the organization or enterprise level. One is, have we created a sense of independence to all the elements so that we can be anti-fragile? That's one element of it. Because if there isn't a degree of independence, there's a degree of interdependence, which creates fragility. That's one aspect. And then the other aspect of it is, have we created sufficient redundance so that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts? And perhaps the opposite of that is we've over optimized, that we've created fragility. So two very observational aspects relative to wisdom in any context, individual, group, or enterprise level. And if I add one other thing to it, the key word is explorer. Are we embracing the notion of being explorers? That's essentially what drives that wisdom. And if I go back a little bit to the book that came out in 2016, there's a full chapter on just that, if you will, on every level.
That's nice one, yeah.
You're thinking something.
I,
Neal, you're thinking something.
Neal.
Forgive me, Jeremy.
Yeah. I'm finding it difficult to see that as a pillar when actually it's almost encompasses everything as well.
That's why it's part of the core.
Guys, when we created the Antifragility House of Antifragility, we did not expect to solve all the problems in the organization in everywhere. We wanted to draw attention to resilience. Often our customers, our clients were simply not resilient to crisis. Crisis didn't lead to them growth, but to the breakdown of their organization cultures. We thought we could help them and combine the things that are business and psychological aspects. It is a fundamental of our House on Antifragility.
But Neal, I don't want to lose, likewise, thank you, Peter, for saying that, because Neal, I don't want to lose what you just said, which is, in addition to what Peter just said, wisdom is only one aspect, but it's core. And that's why we say it's the soul and heart of the house. It actually spans and integrates across all of those, as does empiricism. But that is only one piece of it. It's not a pillar, wisdom.
So is that something that actually creates that inner drive? It's almost like that's where the power is made, basically.
Yeah.
So you can almost shape that you can almost shape that as a rocket, right? It's like powering, right? You get a solid foundation as well, core. Yeah, I mean it's quite powerful because it can be interpreted as well many ways, with the arrow pointing on the purpose as well side, which like gives you a direction.
Yep.
I think that's an interesting model. But to go back to what Neal said, is like I think it's Neal, you were talking about the practicalities of it, right? So it's like how exactly therefore can I apply this? So there's a definition of the principle, but in its application, I guess like you get perhaps like a lot as well other things to support that model, therefore that will indicate more like practical use of how do you therefore generate a core in your system in whatever you want to increase antifragility in. How do you make that core happen, basically? Yeah.
So let's build on that, if that's okay, because I think that's a great segue. If you're okay, Sebastian and Peter, I want to play with this for a little bit, if that's all right. So if I ask you to identify the top 10 people that you associate with, you'll make a list, right? This is at the individual level. You'll make a list. Once you've identified the top 10 people that you associate with, my question becomes okay, why do you associate with them? So just clarify, right, next to each one, why you associate with them. The next question then I would ask is, well, if I were to remove, or if these people were to disappear, which ones would impact you? So this reveals who you're dependent on. So at that point, I would say, okay, based on the ones that would impact you, the next question is, if they do impact you, are there other relationships that you need to build in order to build redundancy so that you're less impacted? And at that point, you begin to identify those that you're dependent on that would reduce your independence. Then you would identify in that exercise the ones that you would need to make redundant. and that's that's at a very much at an individual level. And we could look at it from a relationship perspective. We could look at it from the ones that you have conversations with, or we could look at it from the behaviors that you have as well. What behaviors do you exemplify in the same way? But that's a very practical application, literally, that I go through with executive and leaders in organizations to help them build individual anti-fragility relative to the wisdom aspect. And we haven't even touched the empirical aspect of it. And there's stories actually in the book likewise, and we'll have many more stories, but that's just one example of what's very, very actionable. I hope that helps paint a little bit more detail.
I think what we are going to do, because right now, at the beginning, we create the house, then we describe the pillars, then we add some comments to the pillars, and probably because it's a path, and for us it's challenging because we are doing it in our private time. We would like to create some guidance how to implement each those principles in the real life or in the business. So this work is before us. So we would like to do this, but of course it will take time. If anyone would like to join us, it will be great, because those work we could share among others, not only on three of us.
In my perspective, we have a saying that the fish rots from the head. House of Antifragility is directed to the heads of companies who are open-minded. They are willing to develop and are with for the subordinates. We are aware that this work should gradually and systematically concretize. That consideration should be focused on earning money. This is simple, not only for theoretical perspective.
Should we take more questions or more thoughts? I know we're coming up on time, but I'd love to just seize the opportunity together, if that works. Neal, Jeremy, Matt, Peter, Sebastian.
Matt, maybe you could ask add something, because we are waiting for you.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's been very interesting to listen to you guys and learn more about the theory behind this. And I guess what we've tried to do is get to grips with the model. And there's a wealth of your experience behind this, right? And it's trying to understand enough of that to make sense of the model itself. And hopefully what we've done is we've stress tested different aspects. There's been some probing questions around different areas. I had some questions that were more around, I suppose, and maybe Sebastian, it's particularly of interest for you as well, which are around the personal anti-fragility angle. Whether we've got time to go into that now, I'm not sure, but I'm kind of interested in perhaps another time or another opportunity expanding upon this idea of wisdom, but also the notion of openness. You know, I told you about a bit of my interest in neuroscience and psychology and modeling the self, and there's so much that's been mentioned, and some of the stuff you said at the beginning, Sai, around there's this difference between reality as such and models and perceptions of reality. And I kind of think it's an interesting fundamental tenet resting underneath anti-fragility is around how can we be open to that and embrace change and randomness and then benefit from it. But it poses some interesting questions on the kind of dynamics of self, the way we model the world. And there's this sense that we're constantly trying to create statistical models, I suppose, from information coming in, from our pre-existing beliefs. And then there'll be times where we have to kind of somehow relax those boundaries, transcend in order to learn more and to grow from that new information. So I think perhaps that could take a full hour talking about those things, but if if anyone's got any quick remarks or thoughts, I'd be really interested to hear. It's my hobby horse.
Thank you so much. We hope that you will co-create this model and standards, and we expect your cooperation. We invite you to develop this model together.
Yeah,
Definitely
I think
a broad invitation. Yeah, please go on,
yeah,
Sebastian.
thanks, Matt. Of course, I would love to chat about the individual implementation of this model, or any of this principles in the individual life, in the private life. I would love to share some of my stories. Sometimes Peter is it's scared when I describe him my ideas about challenging myself, and ideas of taking, from my perspective, not so high risk, but from his perspective, very high risk. But I feel that I try to understand, and my body and the signals that my body tells me what is really high risk or low risk, and is those challenges I put myself in are real danger, or it's just something that push myself beyond my my actual boundaries.
Great. I definitely think it's a good jumping off point for maybe further conversations in these areas, right? Perhaps exploring that aspect of personal anti-fragility, and Neal's kind of founded an area around that, which we've been contributing to over time. So I'm sure there's more food for thought, which could help with your model and the kind of community of practice aspect, and help us refine our ideas around it too.
Definitely. So I know we're coming up on time. So can I add one other thing, if you will, before closing remarks that I would love to hear? So in the example that I gave, there was really what I was suggesting relative to the individual on the list. It's a reduction of fragility. It's actually not anti-fragility. And the reduction of fragility doesn't imply necessarily anti-fragility. So I paused there because just to create that distinction. Where I would push it further, and this is where I'm going to tie stress into it, the next question becomes okay, based on the relationships now that you know that you need to create, are you willing to push yourself to create them? Are you willing to experience the stresses and grow? And then you flip into the growth from anti-fragility. So it's a very interesting concept. But
it's a very interesting thought.
Yeah, I just wanted to close it out because a lot of people have associated, to be very frank about it, agility as anti-fragility. They're not equivalent by any stretch. And I think I think all of us here recognize that, but that's part of the noise in the industry, et cetera. And that flip from reduction of fragility does not imply anti-fragility. That's one aspect, but to truly become anti-fragile, it's a very, again, anti-fragile in the sense of achieving greater anti-fragility. It's a very different concept. So perhaps we can have, exactly as Sebastian and Peter mentioned, definitely a broad invitation, and let's continue to explore where we could all take this all around. Would be wonderful.
With pleasure.
Definitely. I mean, I'm learning a lot from this whole process as well. It's really fascinating, and thanks a lot again.
You're all very welcome. And I'm maybe a minute each, just to kind of closing thoughts or what have you. Neal, if that's okay with everybody, we'll do it quickly, but all the way from Neal down the visual.
Okay, so I mean, the closing thought for me is recognizing, yes, the importance of a model. My feeling is that the importance of the tensions between those, and that was something that really came across in this whole conversation, the tension between these dynamics, that's something that I think the model needs to be able to express more clearly to me to have practical application, and that's something that I'd love to see as as the next version and in the future, because I think it can express that. So that's my closing thought.
Thank you, Jeremy, my good friend.
Well, that was quite an interesting ride for me as well. I've learned a lot, and I feel like there's still a lot to learn, basically, and to unpick from that, and a lot to exchange about, actually, because there is a lot of relation with design as well, with the notion of change and transformation, because you use those tension as well, use not only the creative tension to do that. So yeah, definitely let's go and do some follow-ups, because it tied up quite well with some of our reflections we're having as well. And I really appreciate as well the engagement. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Matt, dear friend.
Yeah. So I guess just to echo the gratitude for inviting us along and for engaging in conversation kind of openly as well, and having this constructive dialogue. I think the thing that stood out to me as well as doing a lot of listening to you guys, this idea of soul in the game, and that you guys are using your own experience to feed this model, which is, I think, sort of a courageous thing to do, and it's very challenging to take that wealth of knowledge and to put it into something that's practical, like a model here. So I think taking this step to discuss it further and think about refinements, I think valiant efforts today. So great for that. And then interested in the next steps, the community of practice, maybe diving down into the exploring some of the individual aspects, like what does this mean for individuals within teams, within organizations, and some of the work that can be done there, maybe around what we've been calling relaxing the boundaries, something to explore.
Excellent.
Guys, thank you very, very much for your presence and for a fantastic discussion in my perspective. Thank you for being open and honest with your opinions. They will make us stronger, and we look forward to your presence in this process. Thank you so much for my perspective. It was a pleasure for me.
And for me also, thank you for great conversation. The idea, our idea is to take some ideas from the Taleb work, but add our own experience to develop the model and to develop the idea of the house, and to transform it into the practice ideas, practice model that individuals and business could implement it in the real life, into the business, to become, like Sai said at the beginning, less fragile, to be anti-fragile.
Thank you. And from my perspective, all around, thank you, Neal, for making my first contact together, if you will. Likewise, Jeremy and Matt, and of course Peter and Sebastian, for the great conversation. And we look forward to the possibilities together as we move forward. So thank you all so much.
Wonderful. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Cheers, guys.
Hi.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.